My dog Minion is a barker. He barks all the time, so much so that I have gotten to know his barks. There is the saw a squirrel bark and the UPS man on the front porch going to kill him bark, and the what? You're going out of the front door without me? Don't you realize the world is a dangerous place? Bark. So when at 5 a.m. on a Saturday morning I was awoken by his barking, I was not surprised. What surprised me was the smell. My wife Susan sat bolt upright in bed. What is that? At first I thought maybe it's a natural gas leak, but that wasn't quite right. Maybe sewer smell? I don't know. I was confused. I went looking around the house for the source, but it couldn't be localized. I thought, well, maybe it's coming from outside. I went and got dressed and went out in the front yard, and it was even worse outside than inside. And then I saw my neighbor next door standing in front of his front lawn. He said the smell had woken him up, and he called 311. The fire department was on their way, just in case it was a gas leak. And sure enough, the fire truck shows up. One of those burly firemen jumps off, and the first thing out of his mouth is, "That's a skunk." Well, I had smelled skunk before, but always the dead skunk in the middle of the road variety. This was different. I don't know how to describe it. Fresher? They got the gas sniffer out, and they went looking around just to be safe, but a few minutes later, a flashlight-toting fireman came out and said, "Hey, I found it. I found where the skunk sprayed your back of your house." He came around there and showed us, and there was this 6-foot diameter spray pattern on the walls and windows of my house with these little dime-sized droplets of wet, sticky yellow. Did you know that skunk spray was yellow? Neither did I. I learned a lot about skunks that day. For example, that there is no double-pane glass ever invented that can prevent skunk smell from getting into your house. I learned from Google that tomato juice is good maybe for humans and dogs that have been sprayed, but for a wall, you want some kind of a bleach mixture. We boiled vinegar on the stove. I opened up the back door and the windows to let the smell out. And by this time, my kids were awake. They announced immediately, "We are not going back in that house." My wife took them to Starbucks. And I started cleaning up. A few hours later, it was starting to get a little bit under control, and I was exhausted. I decided to take a break, and I went up to my office, not coincidentally, the farthest place in the house from the source of the smell. Well, a little while later, I hear my dog barking. This is his "I am stressed to the max and will not be ignored" bark. So I went downstairs to check it out. I wasn't too concerned after all. My dog is a barker. And then I saw him in the living room, stiff as a rail, nose pointed down underneath a piece, underneath a piece of furniture. I thought, oh God, please no. I slowly lowered my head down and looked under that armoire. And there it was, a big, black mass of fur with a white stripe. Now, to be perfectly clear, I do not live in the country. I live really close to downtown. This doesn't happen in the city, right? I could feel my shoulders tighten up and my chest constrict, and I was about to panic, and then I realized, oh, my dog will get sprayed if I don't do something. I immediately grabbed his collar, rushed outside, and closed the door behind me. This is when I realized there is a skunk loose in my house. And I was stuck outside. I mean, I can't go back in there. There's a skunk loose in my house. Anything. I didn't want to get sprayed. Fortunately, I had my phone in my pocket, and I started dialing. Called my wife. Don't bother coming home. Called 311 and got a hold of animal control. They were not very helpful. Once they determined that nobody had been bitten and there was no rabies risk, they said, oh yeah, we can have somebody out there in 48 hours. But there's a skunk loose in my house. They did not seem too concerned. I was concerned. Google again helped me. I found all of the companies that specialized in pest removal, and I started calling them, got answering machine after answering machine. Finally, when I hit Urban Jungle Wildlife Services, they answered the phone and told me they could have somebody there within an hour. When the technician arrived, he exuded competence. He had a uniform. He had a truck full of equipment. He had a cage with a black cloth to throw over it. He had a pole with a loop at the end. That pole with the loop looked really official. He had a gun, a pellet rifle. He told me that he's done this before, but it's really rare to have a skunk in your house. If a skunk was in there, it was probably sick or dying. The risk of rabies was not small. He went in, and 20 minutes later, he came back out and said, there's good news. I found the skunk. But the bad news is I'm not going to be able to get him to get into the cage. He had found his way into this storage space underneath these stairs and was way down in the corner, down below that very first stair. Impossible to get to him. Extraction would be difficult. It would not go well for the skunk. Reluctantly, I gave permission to use deadly force. By this point, I did not have much sympathy for that skunk. But I paid a price because the skunk sprayed inside my house. Now, I thought it smelled bad when he had sprayed the outside of my house. Oh man, the next few days was a blur of hotel rooms, of collecting clothes and trying to get them clean so my kids could go to school without smelling like skunk, of washing, gagging, bleaching, gagging, deodorizing, gagging, painting, gagging, rinse, repeat. And after several days, deciding it was okay for my family to come home. It's been 18 months since the great skunk disaster. And I only occasionally get a whiff of the lingering odor. But I do recognize my dog's expanded vocabulary. And I will never forget the "there's a skunk loose in my house" bark. Thank you.